The Man Who Planted Trees. 15-minute script. There's a quiet corner of the world that few people know about. It's hidden in the hills of Provence, far from the noise and rush of the cities, where the wind carries the scent of time and the sun paints golden light across the earth. But when I first saw it, many years ago, it was barren. The hills were dry and cracked. The rivers had stopped flowing. The villages stood half empty, their wells long since dry. And I, like so many others, was searching for something I couldn't name. I was young then, walking through the lonely countryside, my thoughts heavy. And that's when I met him. At first, he looked just like another shepherd, an old man, his back slightly bent, with a bag slung over his shoulder and a staff in his hand. But he wasn't tending to his sheep when I found him. He was kneeling in the dust, digging small holes in the earth. I stopped to watch. He reached into his bag, pulled out an acorn, and pressed it gently into the hole. Then he moved a few steps and did it again, and again, and again. Curiosity got the better of me. "Good afternoon," I said. He looked up at me, his face lined but kind, and gave a small nod. "Good afternoon," he replied. I asked him what he was doing. "Planting trees," he said simply. I couldn't help but smile at that. The hills around us were nothing but dust and stone. "Do you really think they'll grow here?" I asked. He gave a small shrug, his eyes calm. "If I don't plant them, nothing will grow. But if I do, maybe one day they will." And then he went back to his work. That night, he let me stay at his little cottage, a humble home, warm and neat. He shared his bread and soup with me, and we sat by the fire as he told me his story. He had been a farmer once, long ago, but life had been cruel. He lost his wife, his son, his farm, and so he came here to the hills to live with his sheep in solitude. At first, he told me, the emptiness of the land mirrored the emptiness he felt inside. But then one day, he found an acorn on the ground. He picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. It was so small, he said, and yet it held everything it needed to become a tree. That thought stayed with him, and so the next day he planted it, and then another, and then another, and every day after that he planted more. "Why?" I asked him. "Because someone has to," he said softly. "The world doesn't fix itself." The next morning, I walked with him through the hills as he worked. It was quiet, just the sound of the wind and the crunch of stones underfoot. His movements were steady, patient. Dig, plant, cover, press. Dig, plant, cover, press. At one point, he paused and pointed. "Look there," he said. I followed his finger and saw, barely visible in the distance, a small grove of saplings, fragile but alive. "Those are from 3 years ago," he told me. "They made it." The pride in his voice was quiet, but it was there. I left the hills the next day, but his words stayed with me. Years later, I returned. What I saw took my breath away. The hills were no longer gray and lifeless. They were green, vibrant, alive. The streams had come back, flowing clear and cool. Birdsong filled the air. Wildflowers dotted the meadows. And the villages below, they were alive again, too. People had come back. Children played in the shade of trees. Families planted gardens and rebuilt their homes. And there he was, still planting. "You came back," he said, smiling. "I had to see if you'd given up," I told him. He chuckled softly. There's still more to do." I kept visiting him over the years, even as his hair turned white and his hands grew rough and cracked from the work. He never stopped. The seasons passed. Spring brought new shoots. Summer tested them with heat. Autumn painted the leaves gold, and winter blanketed the hills in quiet snow. People in the villages began to notice the change in the land, but they didn't know his name. They thought it was nature's doing, or God's will, or perhaps luck. But I knew better. I knew it was him. One man, one choice, repeated every day. I last saw him when he was very old. He was sitting on a rock, resting, watching the wind move through his forest. "You've done something incredible," I told him. He shook his head. "No," he said, "the trees did it. I just gave them a chance." He closed his eyes then, and I knew he was at peace. Now I sit here under the shade of his forest, telling you his story. I tell it because it reminds me, and maybe it will remind you, that one person can make a difference. You may feel small. You may feel like what you do doesn't matter, but it does. Every kind word, every small act of courage, every quiet choice to keep going, it matters. He planted his trees. What will you plant? Because the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. But the second best time is now. So plant your tree and never stop.